Long ago, in the ancient land of Persia, there was a great emperor named Ahasuerus. He was a good man, and he tried to be a good king, but he spent most of his time enjoying the luxuries of his royal court. And whatever he wanted, the people around him were glad to supply. For Ahasuerus's word was law, and he held all the power of Persia in his hands. After a time, he thought of almost nothing but his own entertainment, and began to let other people do his really important thinking for him. One day, in the middle of one of his grand parties, he sent word to his queen, whose name was Vashti, to come and dance before him and all his friends. Now Vashti, when she heard this, was very upset. "I am Queen of Persia," she said to the messenger. "It is not proper for me to have to dance for everyone as if I were an entertainer. Tell the emperor, my husband, that I will not do this." Ahasuerus, hearing her reply, was furious. Nobody said no to him. He proclaimed, "From this moment, Vashti is no longer my queen. She must leave my palace, and I will find myself a new queen." And his friends told him he was absolutely right, although, if they had been real friends instead of just people who wanted favors from him, they might have advised him differently. The king sent messengers throughout his empire, instructing them, "Bring back to me the most beautiful unmarried women, and I shall select a new queen." And from among all these women he chose a woman named Esther. "Not only is Esther beautiful," thought Ahasuerus, "she is also intelligent and very sweet-natured. She will make a wonderful queen." Now Esther was an orphan. She had been raised by her older cousin, a very wise man named Mordecai. Both Esther and Mordecai were Jews, although she had never thought to mention this while the king had been choosing a queen, for in those days many religions were allowed in Persia. When she found out she was to be queen, Esther told Mordecai, "I shall miss you, cousin." "And I shall miss you, Esther," replied Mordecai. "But do not worry. Even though you will live in the royal palace, we can see each other. Every afternoon I shall come and sit outside the gates of the palace. If you can see me that day, send a servant to bring me to you." And so every afternoon Mordecai would be waiting by the gates, and many days he had the opportunity to go in and see his cousin, who was now queen of all Persia. But one day, as Mordecai sat near the gates, he overheard a conversation from inside that made him sit up and listen carefully. Two men were plotting together to kill King Ahasuerus. Mordecai listened until he knew from their conversation who the two men were. And when he went in to see Queen Esther, he told her what he had learned. Esther immediately sent a warning to the king, explaining how Mordecai had obtained the information. "I will have these two men arrested at once," said King Ahasuerus. And when he did, the two men confessed. But once the king had removed the threat, he was so busy with all the splendors of his court that he forgot to thank Mordecai. Now at the time all this was happening, working as the king's prime minister was an evil man named Haman. As Ahasuerus spent less and less time running the government, Haman took more and more power. He even demanded that everyone bow down to him as they bowed down to the king. One day, as Haman rode forth from the palace, he noticed a man who did not bow down before him. Haman asked a servant, "Who is that man?" "Well, I don't know much about him, my lord," said the servant. "I know only that his name is Mordecai, and that he can often be found here by the palace gates. And the only other thing I know about him is that he is a Jew." "Mordecai the Jew, eh?" said Haman. Inquiring later, he found that the Jews of Persia would not bow down before the king, for they considered it an insult to God, to whom alone they would bow. And from that day forth, Haman hated Mordecai and distrusted all Jews. Now a few weeks later, King Ahasuerus had trouble sleeping one night. He called his royal reader to him and said, "Read to me the things that have happened since I have been king, and perhaps after a while I will be able to sleep." When the reader reached the part where Mordecai had saved the king's life by warning him about the deadly plot, Ahasuerus interrupted. "And what did I do? How did I thank this, Mordecai? I can't recall." The royal reader answered, "Well, I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I don't see anything in here about your having thanked him at all." "What? That's dreadful. He saved my life. I wonder what I should do to thank him." The next morning the king, who wasn't used to thinking for himself, asked Haman for advice. "Haman, what should the king do for a man who has done him a truly great service?" Since Haman was a man who always thought of himself first, he was convinced the king was thinking of him. "What shall I ask for?" he wondered. I know. "Your Majesty," he said, "the man whom the king favors should be dressed in the king's own robes and seated upon the king's own white horse. Then some great lord of the court should lead horse and rider through the streets of your royal city, proclaiming, 'Behold the man whom the king honors! Behold the man whom the king loves!'" "What a brilliant suggestion!" exclaimed Ahasuerus. "And Haman, the man to be honored, is—" "Yes, Your Majesty?" "Mordecai." "Mordecai?" "Yes. And since you are the most important man in my court, you shall lead him through the city." So Haman, fuming inside, led Mordecai through the streets for the great honor he himself had sought. And now, hating Mordecai twice as much as before, Haman determined to have revenge. For often, people who are bitter, instead of taking responsibility for improving their own lives, blame their unhappiness on others. Haman went to the king, saying, "Your Majesty, you are the glorious heart and soul of all Persia." "Why, of course, Haman." "And yet, there is a group of people in your empire who admire and worship someone else more than they do you." "What? Who are these people?" "They are the Jews, Your Majesty. They worship their God more than they worship you." "But, after all, it is their God," said Ahasuerus, who, despite his frequent foolishness, still had a kind heart. "But, sire, if all your citizens were to do as these Jews do, soon they might not honor you at all. I have written a little law that encourages the other people of Persia to rise up on a certain day and kill all the Jews. The law needs only your signature to make it happen." And Haman convinced King Ahasuerus to sign that law. When the shocking news got out, Mordecai rushed at once to see his cousin, the queen. "Esther, surely God has made you queen of Persia, so that you might go before the king and show him the dreadful mistake he is making." "But, Mordecai, I cannot go before him. The laws of the palace say I may go only if he sends for me. If I go to him without his sending for me, it means my death." "And if you do not go, it means the death of all the Jews." Torn between fear for her own life and the truth she knew lay in her cousin's words, Esther sat thinking in silence. At last she spoke. "There is only one possible choice, then. I shall go to the king. Ask all the people to pray for my safety for 3 days." Then, on the 4th day, Queen Esther dressed herself in a beautiful gown and went to the courtyard outside the king's throne room. She walked up and down there, hoping the king would notice her and call her in. When he failed to see her, she drew nearer to the door, and then, uttering a silent prayer, Esther stepped through the doorway of the throne room. Someone saw her and pointed to her in surprise. Heads turned. There were a few gasps of shock. And then everyone fell silent. They knew the queen had brought about her own death. The guards were so startled they didn't move for a moment. But then they drew their swords and started towards Esther. Just then, following everyone else's gaze, King Ahasuerus turned. "Esther, my queen!" he exclaimed. "How delightful! Come, sit here by me." He had called her to him. She was safe. Esther smiled and went to sit by the king. After they had talked for some time, she said, "Your Majesty, would you do me the great honor of coming to my rooms tomorrow night, so that I might give you a special dinner?" "I would love that, Esther." "Thank you, sire. Oh, and would you be kind enough to bring with you your noble Prime Minister, Haman?" Hearing this, Haman was overjoyed. What an honor! For, of course, he did not know that the queen was a Jew. The next night Esther served a most wonderful dinner, and she herself so charmed the king that he told her, "Esther, you give me great delight. How can I demonstrate my pleasure? Is there anything at all I can do for you?" "Your Majesty, there is something. What would you say if I told you that someone in your empire is planning to kill me?" "Kill you?" said the astonished king, leaping to his feet. Ahasuerus remembered the plot against his own life, and how Esther and Mordecai had saved him. And now Esther, too, was in danger. Meanwhile, Haman, like the king, had risen to his feet at the queen's startling news. "Whoever this traitor may be," he snarled, "we will execute him at once." "Yes," said the king. "Who is it?" Esther turned. She pointed to the prime minister. "It is Haman, your Majesty. He wants to kill all the Jews in Persia. I am a Jew." And in that instant, as if seeing a clear picture of himself and his life, the king realized all that he had done wrong. "Guards!" he shouted. In a moment the room was filled with soldiers. Ahasuerus said, "Haman, you have spoken your own death sentence." The soldiers took Haman from the room, and that was the end of him. But Ahasuerus said to Esther, "Having signed the law encouraging an attack on the Jews, I cannot change it. A law is a law. But I shall see to it that they are given weapons with which to defend themselves." "And if it please your Majesty," Esther said, "my cousin Mordecai humbly suggests that you encourage the other people of Persia to help defend the Jews." "Good. And I shall make this wise cousin of yours my adviser, so that you and he can help me to gain wisdom and prevent such a thing from happening again." And so, on the day which Haman had intended for the destruction of the Jews, their attackers found not only the Jews well armed and ready to defend themselves, but also the caring neighbors of the Jews determined to prevent this evil from happening, and the Jews of Persia were saved. Today we remember this story, and we celebrate it as the holiday called Purim. We remind ourselves how terrible it is when someone hates, as Haman did, and particularly when someone hates a whole group of people, as he did. For a person so filled with bitterness and hatred has little room left inside for joy or friendship. Also at Purim, we recall the wisdom of Mordecai, and we honor brave Queen Esther, who risked her own life to save the lives of others. We remember, too, what both Esther and King Ahasuerus learned. It's up to each of us to take responsibility, not only for our own good, but also for the good of other people around us. For more titles from Jim Weiss and Well-Trained Mind Press, please visit us at jimweiss.com or welltrainedmind.com. Thank you for listening.